Hey Team Bio, welcome to your screencast on symbiotic relationships. So we define a symbiotic relationship as a close ecological relationship between two or more organisms. I'll write that down. Okay, so a common misconception about symbiotic relationships is that they are always positive. But in reality, symbiotic relationships can be positive for both or negative for one and not the other. Well, there are a bunch of different categories. We'll get into talking about them in a second. But often, young bio students use mutualism and symbiosis interchangeably, but know that symbiotic relationships categorize a whole host of different relationships and not just ones that are mutually beneficial. Okay, but we'll start with talking about the example of symbiotic relationships that is mutually beneficial. This is called mutualism, and interactions between two species that have a mutualistic relationship is positive for both organisms. A great example of that is coral. Coral is actually composed of two organisms living within this one structure. One is the coral, which is a tiny little animal, which is contained within a polyp and builds a structure around it that you probably think of when you think of a coral. It's this dense structure that houses the animal of the coral and also houses a mutualistic algae that is living within the coral. So the coral is providing shelter, and the algae is doing photosynthesis and is providing sugar to the relationship. In addition, the coral is producing a nitrogen waste product, and the algae picks up that nitrogen and uses it to synthesize its own amino acids and DNA. So this relationship is mutually beneficial for both the coral and the algae, which is living within it, which is a very hard to pronounce name, but it's called zooxanthellae is the type of algae that is living within the coral. Okay, a more common mutualistic relationship that you've probably all observed is a plant and its pollinator. The plants I made this too small. Okay, what are the pollinators getting? They are getting sugar in the form of nectar and sometimes pollen itself, which can be protein rich. You can see on the legs of this bee, this bee is harvesting a ton of pollen and collecting it on its back legs here. What do the plants get out of this relationship? Well, the pollen that these pollinators are collecting are actually kind of similar to the sperm of the plants. And the pollinator will fly to another flower and deposit the pollen, which will travel down into the ovule and fertilize what will become the developing egg for the plant. So the pollinators are getting sugar and the plants are getting sex. The pollinators are delivering their gametes from plant to plant. Okay, so these are both examples of mutualism, relationships that are beneficial to both organisms. Parasitism is our second form of symbiotic relationship, and in a parasitic relationship, it is positive for one organism and negative for the other. A prime example of parasitism is the relationship between ticks and humans. You all probably know that ticks are out and about in the early spring and in the summer somewhat, and then definitely again in the fall, and you have to watch out because while one tick feeding on the blood supply of a human is not necessarily super impactful to the overall health of the human, the ticks can carry Lyme disease and other diseases. So, ticks get blood. I guess I forgot to say that when a tick bites you, it swells up with your blood. If you pop it open after it's full up like a balloon like this, it will be a bloody mess everywhere. It's kind of gross. And the ticks are deriving nutrients and energy from sucking the blood of the things that they bite. In the case of a human, this is not so great because the ticks also carry disease. And so, while it's positive interaction for the tick, it is a negative interaction for the human. Another example of parasitism is the relationship between an oak tree and a non-stinging wasp. So, this structure here is called an oak tree gall. And what happens is that the wasp lays its eggs on the oak tree, and the developing larvae secrete a chemical that induces the growth of plant tissue around the wasp larvae that is housed inside of this structure. So it's negative for the oak tree because not only does the oak tree build this structure for the wasp and devotes energy and resources to doing so, the larvae is also feeding off of parts of the oak inside of this structure. So the tree is devoting resources, and the wasp is getting a home and food. These structures, I think, are actually quite beautiful. Galls form not just on oak trees, but on other plants. Another really common form of gall is a goldenrod gall. So if you go out into a large field right around now, you'll see them. They're pretty cool if you open them up. Sometimes you'll see probably not anymore, but if you do this in the summer, you might see the wasp larvae, and they have a very cool structure inside. So next time you see a gall, just split it open and check out what is going on inside. If it's not fully dried up, it can be pretty cool. Okay, so those are examples of parasitic relationships, positive for one and negative for another. Our last example of our symbiotic relationships is called commensalism. Commensalism is when an interaction is positive for one species and then it doesn't affect the other species at all. So a perfect example of commensalism is the relationship between grazing animals, I guess we could say the zebra here, and the cattle egret. What happens in this relationship is that as the zebra is going along, living its life, grazing and eating plants in the savanna, it is kicking up dust and dirt and also tiny little insects, grasshoppers and bugs and all sorts of delicious feast. And so the egret travels around with the zebra and it eats all the insects that are scared up as the zebra treads around on the savanna. And the zebra is totally unaffected by this relationship. So it is an example of commensalism. It doesn't get any harm or receive any benefit from the presence of the cattle egret. Another example of commensalism is whales and barnacles. Whales travel around the ocean, and they, as they age, they develop large patches of barnacles. Barnacles are tiny little filter feeders that secrete a hard shell-like structure that keeps them safe, but they can also open up and they filter feed on whatever is in the water, tiny little plankton, for example. So the whale is unaffected by this relationship, and the barnacle gets a home and also a free ride around the ocean, where it is constantly exposed to fresh, new ocean water and potentially delicious things to eat in that water. Interestingly enough, there are specific types of barnacles that inhabit specific types of whales. So you'll see different barnacles on a gray whale than on a humpback whale, for example. And yeah, okay, so commensalism, some people would argue, is a false category, and if you were to dive deeper into commensalism, you would actually see that they are a low-grade form of mutualism or parasitism, where just the benefit or negative impact on one another is so small or so slight it barely even registers. I'm sure you could imagine a situation where maybe the zebra actually does benefit from the presence of the cattle egret because it's eating insects that might bite the zebra. And I'm sure you can imagine that a whale could gather so many barnacles. The whale can actually gather like over 1,000 pounds of barnacles, and this additional weight is actually a slight disadvantage for the whale. So yes, some people would argue that commensalism is not a true category, and it would, if we were to dive deeper and study it more fully, we would actually see its parasitism and mutualism. But I think it's worth knowing this word regardless. Okay, so other interspecific interactions that you should know about. Inter meaning between specific two species. We've talked about intraspecific interactions. So those are relationships, interactions that occur within a species, and interspecific interactions. So if we were to place this would be within species, and then between two different species. Other forms of interspecific interactions that are important but maybe don't quite fall to the level of symbiosis because they're not so close or so tight, like physically close. An example would be predation. So when you have a lion eating a gazelle, this would be an example of a predator and prey. It's positive for one and negative for another. Another example of an interspecific interaction is herbivory. This is when a primary consumer is eating a producer, and it is positive for one and negative for the other. And then the last interspecific interaction that we can talk about is competition. We also talked about competition as being an intraspecific interaction. So when species are competing with members of the same species for resources and space, but this can also happen between different species if they occupy the same biological niche, meaning that they are competing for food or space within an environment. So an example of competition might be two different finches that are different species, but they both use the same nesting material. This would be interspecific competition, and this is negative for both of those organisms. Okay, that wraps up our screencast on symbiotic relationships. See you in class.